I met the late Patrick Emmanuel at Howard University in Washington, D.C. while I was a graduate student there. And my advisor at the time, the now deceased Archibald Singham, had brought Patrick to Howard. And he kept talking to me about Pato, nickname, right? We met, and within 10 minutes of a conversation, I felt I had known him for many years. Was very interested in what I had to say because I was working on a doctoral dissertation entitled The Political Economy of Foreign Direct Investment in the Commonwealth Caribbean from World War II to the 1970s. And I was studying bauxite, manufacturing, banking, tourism, and a few other issues in between. And Pato was really very generous with his ideas and excitement. And then I recall at the time when there was a series here that Cave Hill was edited by Professor Woodville Marshall, and it dealt with some aspects of decolonization, as I recall. And there was a piece Pato contributed, and I read that, and there was an expression, a term he used in that piece, the Bush experiment of 1946. And I remember there was a governor of Barbados by the name of Sir Grattan Bush. And as I grew up in Hillby, I used to hear about this Governor Bush, had no idea who he was or whatever, but Governor Bush. And as I read it, I discovered something, that the strategy for decolonization in the British West Indies was designed and it was ordered and regulated and controlled in many ways by Great Britain. And the US, of course, was very visible in the region and had made it clear to the British that they would not tolerate a decolonization strategy in which these territories became radicalized and went out on their own, pretending that they could acquire sovereignty and use it exactly as they felt. Because I want to submit here that the US has sought from the beginning this decolonization moment after the Second World War to control this business of sovereignty in a very concrete and direct way. And if you're familiar with the many overthrows of governments and assassination of leaders and all those things that were carried out in the name of security in the war against communism, that was really a fundamental attack on the integrity of sovereign autonomy, because in my view, if that had been allowed to play itself out the way people achieving it felt they should, it would have thwarted many of the things the US had in mind for the region and beyond. And the arena is replete with examples of things that were done during that period, right? And this Bush experiment, decisions were made by the British. In 1945 and 1946, they issued two white papers. The first was called The Future of the Colonies, and the second was called The Future of the Territories. Within 1 year, Britain ceased to talk about colonies and shifted to territories. Another Bush experiment, the idea was for Barbados in particular, since he was the governor of Barbados, to take the colony through decolonization, where the majority of the people who remained at that time, people said disenfranchised, they didn't have the sovereignty, and I coined my own term, unenfranchised. And remember, 1950 was the year the Representation of the People's Act was passed, and it took effect in 1951, and that was the year Barbados had universal elections based on universal adult suffrage. And for the first time, the electoral rolls grew from about 4,000 to almost 100,000, just like that. And what was the reason for this? Because the British colonial order, in controlling the process, had made sure that property, private property in the means of production of some minimal value, was the basic criterion among a range of criteria for eligibility to vote. And at that moment then, you had masses of people who began voting for labor, and at the same time they worked on plantations controlled by the plantocracy, whose aim was to limit and control the political significance of decolonization. And if the plan there, I remember the late Edward Talma, who was a member of Parliament, arguing that the purpose of the Bush experiment was to use Barbados as the test case, and if it worked well, it would be extended to the British West Indies and beyond. I'm not sure that he was accurate, but he was at least within the right domain in the argument he made. And that meant that you would have the masses of black people becoming enfranchised, but property would remain exactly where it was. That was at the heart of it. And there's a good deal that has changed in Barbados since that time, but the fundamental infrastructure of that remains very much in place. So you can have all the political sovereignty you want, but you would not be able to determine how the property is going to be used. And as I remember giving a lecture in Barbados in 2001, the National Heroes Lecture, and I noticed something which was very basic. And it was that at that time, if you worked on a plantation, very often you live in a tenantry which consisted of land owned by the plantations. And they restricted your ability in a number of ways. Many of the chattel houses built on those lands, some were owned by the plantations themselves. So there was very little room, even with universal suffrage, for people to control the conditions of their existence. And that, of course, changed a great deal, right? But the insight I got from Patrick Emmanuel was really tremendous in helping me to understand post-war Barbados. So that's how I wanted to introduce Patrick to you, so to speak. Now, for this evening, right, in talking about the crisis of global capitalism and its impact on the Caribbean, you know this is a very broad topic. There's not just one Caribbean as far as I'm concerned. There are lots of Caribbeans in a sense. The moment you get down to the particulars and you ask questions about Cuba or the Dominican Republic, Haiti, the English-speaking Caribbean, and other territories, you know that you cannot overgeneralize, although there are certain common features, right? So it's the general ones I would like to focus on. But in getting there, let me make some remarks, right? Having looked at recent United Nations Development Program Human Development reports, you notice that Barbados has consistently scored very highly in terms of social indicators. But those social indicators do not tell you anything about the economic structure of the society, where wealth is concentrated, and how that impacts or affects how people actually live. But it says something which is extremely important about Barbados and the achievements that have been established. So I was thinking about that as I was working on this document, and it occurred to me that on a global scale in many of the countries of the world, women produce most of the food and own very little of the property. And that is an incontrovertible fact on the basis of the evidence. At the same time, it's clear that many women, I wouldn't say all, are very vulnerable victims of class exploitation, gender, and racial oppression. And wars fought under capitalism, and we see them today in various parts of the world, are far more bloody, and they make victims of women and girls who are often defenseless, always defenseless in the condition of war. The production of weapons today, from the years of the wars in the Balkans, the US has been making weapons that include depleted plutonium, uranium-245, and using them. And I argue that this is to test how human bodies can actually react to low-intensity nuclear warfare, which is what I call it today. And this has tremendous impact on all human beings affected, but of course women and girls suffer in many ways. So there's something predatory at work here. And also you can see dimensions of it in human trafficking. The modern slavery in the world today, it is estimated to be about 30 million slaves. Not as we knew slavery earlier, but people live in various conditions of enslavement, and many of them are women and girls. So there's a massive insecurity that lots of women have to endure. But it's also clear in our region, which has one of the highest murder rates per capita, the broader Caribbean region, clearly a lot of women and girls are victims, and there's a lot of violence against many women in households. So the growth of gun violence, the growth of drug trafficking through the region, these have their consequences. In Barbados, I think I understand that large numbers of women not only head households, but they have become holders of mortgages and other things like that. And in this crisis that is gripping Barbados today, which I think is at a fairly early moment, and there's a lot more, I think, that is going to affect the country negatively. This is no little recession. If people are talking that, you should be very cautious in believing it. But I want to suggest here that with the increase in the dependency ratio in the household context, large numbers of women who are hard-pressed in this regard are also suffering immensely. I'm not suggesting that no men are suffering, right? So don't try to create some incongruous juxtaposition in here, right? But I talk about some of this as factual and I think incontrovertible, right? Now, we live in a moment of, they call it austerity, which I consider to be a class project orchestrated to transfer the massive share of the burden of restructuring on the masses of the people and away from those who own the means of production, whether they are here or any other part of the world. So it's an adjustment process here. Now, the government might talk about a 4% contraction in GDP to meet stipulations from the IMF, yeah, but if we're only at a 2% at this moment, and there's another 2% to come, you know it's bound to be hell, right? And I think we're going to see a lot more, right? So that is the context for getting this point going. Now, there is a book written by a Jamaican economist by the name of Peter Blair Henry, who is the dean of the business school at NYU in New York City. The book is entitled Turnaround. And in this book, Henry argues that Barbados has stood out in a very positive way because of the particular policies it has pursued. And another Jamaican, Orlando Patterson, says, I beg to differ, it's the institutions that have put Barbados where it is. And I argue that Blair and Patterson are just different by degree and not by kind on this particular issue because they don't focus concretely on capitalism, at least as I understand it. So we ask the question, how is it that a country rated by UNDP as highly as Barbados has been, and by a number of scholars, and by the general public in Barbados and other parts of the Caribbean and beyond, because it would seem to me that when you describe Barbados as really a highly developed country by standards, whether it's third world or what have you, you ask, what happened? And I want to argue this evening that what has happened in Barbados was in the making for a very long time, and it cannot be situated simply at a year called 2008. That would be a serious mistake, right? So we have to look beyond common sense, I would argue, right? Now, Barbados is also placed in a very high regard placed second in Latin America and the Caribbean in the Global Competitiveness Report based on a study of 142 countries and number 27 worldwide for its overall, quote, global competitiveness. That's enviable, isn't it? But now we are in deep, deep problematic circumstances. So we need to probe what these things mean. Now, of course, I would argue here that the deteriorating situation in the country is marked by economic stagnation. And a good deal of this has to be explained by phenomenal changes which have taken place in the world. I understand that agriculture is also going through a profound form of hemorrhaging. And I want to argue here that I do not see any long-term future for sugar in Barbados. And this is not an ideological position I hold, but I look at the evidence. There is scarcely any Caribbean country today producing sugar for the world market that produces it at less than 25 to 33 cents per pound. And the world market price hovers around 11 to 13 cents. Why would anybody want to buy sugar at 29 or 23 or 30 cents if it's on the world market at 13? And Barbados cannot go back to where it was with sugar. There is no future there, not because there's a lot of idle land. You say, hey, we have the land, let's grow the canes and the sugar. It doesn't work like that. If that were so, it would be very simple. So the future of export agriculture, I think, in this regard is grim. And even if Barbados were to go through a phase of refurbishing a sugar factory or building the new one to replace Port Vale, which I have understood to be outdated. Remember in 2008, I was here and the head of, I think, the BAMC was on TV saying that they needed to build a new factory and it would cost about $500 million to build. And then I said, if sugar is dying, who is going to invest that money in a factory that's going to only grind canes for 3 months or 4 months of the year? It makes absolutely no sense, right? But there's some other issues in play. And I ask myself, with all of this in mind, how do we explain the situation that I'm going to use to go further into this context of crisis? I think we are in what I call, based on scholarship I have reviewed, the second machine age. And the second machine age is being led by robotics. And you can see this, and we are going to show a video here soon that will give, it runs about 13 minutes, that gives you an idea of exactly what is happening in the robotics revolution on a global scale and what it means for countries all over the world, not only those in the Caribbean. That, I think, is contributing immensely because it undermines the competitiveness of places that are not strategically positioned to meet these challenges. The second is that following the collapse of the USSR and the coming of the European Union, there was a shift in interest from a lot of the so-called developing world to Central and Eastern Europe and Russia, and that contributed to the decline, the net decline in productive investment flowing into the region. Then, of course, China came on the scene, India to a somewhat lesser extent, as the platform for global mass production. And there is no commodity which you could produce in Barbados or the Caribbean today that cannot be produced in China as efficiently or much more cheaply. And therefore, the competitive edge there is hemorrhaging our region. And then, of course, you go back to NAFTA when that came, it sucked out a lot of the investment from the region. And we've not been in the position to do a great deal about that. And another important phenomenon that I think is going to have tremendous implications, not only for the economic process, but also for higher education, tertiary education. Some of you or all of you might be familiar with a phenomenon called MOOCs, M-O-O-C-S, Massive Online Open Courses. And in the United States, the state governments require all of the universities they fund to put all the syllabi and course material online free, so that anyone who is wired, who is connected, can have access and get more education, more exposure than you might get in a regular academic program. The World Bank has joined, some UN agencies are involved, and a number of private universities, the so-called Ivies, Harvard, MIT, Yale, and company, are also in this business. And only last week, Cornell announced that they are putting a large number of courses online, free of charge. Now, some of these are for fee, but I want to suggest that this is a new thing, and as soon as they have worked out the accreditation process, you are going to see a massive shift. And what am I getting at here? That this is going to drive down the average price of labor on a global scale, and that is what the big investors want. But sooner or later, with robotics and the cheapening of labor on the average, you have to ask, now, who is going to be left to buy these commodities? Because it is still, the US is considered to be a 70% consumer-driven economy. And as I say that, two pieces I want to bring together. Nick Hanauer, I don't know the man, I've read some of his stuff. He is a multi-billionaire venture capitalist on the West Coast. And he published an article recently entitled, "The Pitchforks Are Coming." And he's saying to the wealthy like himself, the people are not going to put up with this thing we are doing to them. We need to change. And he said, by the way, let me make a point. He says the idea that people invest in businesses to create jobs is one of the biggest myths fostered. He said, in his view, as a multi-billionaire capitalist, it's the consumer who buys the goods, who actually create the jobs. And you're familiar with PayPal. Thiel, who is the founder of PayPal, recently said there's also another massive myth, and he is a very wealthy man. He says, in effect, competition is for losers. He says, I don't know a capitalist who goes into business begging people to come compete with him. He says, frankly, he says, as far as he's concerned, the aim is to destroy all the competition that you can and get rid of half your workforce if you can. Because you want to build machines that are proud of the people who build it. Yeah, literally. This is in print. Engineers say, we want to build machines that are proud of us. And that moment is coming. Look at medicine, look at law, look at engineering, look across the spectrum, and you will find what I'm saying here. You can sit as a doctor at a hospital in New York and perform surgery on a patient in London. You don't have to be there. Critical. At the same time, all the law firms that typically hired thousands of people to do all the basic research for them for cases now use machines. and the machines do the work in a fraction of the time at a fraction of the cost. So a lot of young lawyers and legal analysts are now on the market, no jobs. And a large number of young people with law degrees in the US are now suing the universities where they study because they have massive debt, and they promise them, oh, you're going to have a lucrative future. And there are many who are making $30,000, $40,000 a year as opposed to the $90,000 to $100,000 they thought they would start at. And a lot of them are back home living with their parents. It is estimated that in the US today, 50% of college graduates since 2007 are living at home. And 1/3 of all the young people enrolled in two-year colleges that issue what we call associate degrees in the US already have BA and BS degrees because they can't find work. They've gone back to school. It is a harrowing situation that is taking place there, right? Now, these are among the factors, I think, that are driving part of the process in the Caribbean. And it's at this point that I want to introduce the video on robotics. Are robots hurting jobs? We will view that for about 13, 14 minutes, and then I will come back, connect dimensions of the scientific and technological revolution, and then focus specifically on a few of the Caribbean countries as examples of where we are, right? So let's watch on to the videotape.
One of the hallmarks of the 21st century is that we are all having more and more interactions with machines and fewer with human beings. If you've lost your white-collar job to downsizing or to a worker in India or China, you're most likely a victim of what economists have called technological unemployment. There's a lot of it going around, with more to come. At the vanguard of this new wave of automation is the field of robotics. Everyone has a different idea of what a robot is and what they look like, but the broad, universal definition is a machine that can perform the job of a human. They could be mobile or stationary, hardware or software, and they are marching out of the realm of science fiction and into the mainstream.
The story will continue in a moment. The age of robots has been anticipated since the beginning of the last century. Fritz Lang fantasized about it in his 1927 film Metropolis. In the 1940s and 50s, robots were often portrayed as household help.
May I take your hat and coat?
And by the time the Star Wars trilogy arrived, robots with their computerized brains and nerve systems had been fully integrated into our imagination. Now they're finally here, but instead of serving us, we find them competing for our jobs. And according to MIT professors Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee, one of the reasons for the jobless recovery.
Our economy is bigger than it was before the start of the Great Recession. Corporate profits are back. Business investment in hardware and software is back higher than it's ever been. What's not back is the jobs.
And you think technology and increased automation is a factor in that?
Absolutely.
The percentage of Americans with jobs is at a 20-year low. Just a few years ago, if you traveled by air, you would have interacted with a human ticket agent. Today, those jobs are being replaced by robotic kiosks. Bank tellers have given way to ATMs. Sales clerks are surrendering to e-commerce.
I'm an automated system that can...
And switchboard operators and secretaries to voice recognition technology.
There are lots of examples of routine, middle-skilled jobs that involve relatively structured tasks, and those are the jobs that are being eliminated the fastest. Those kinds of jobs are easier for our friends in the artificial intelligence community to design robots to handle them. They could be software robots, they could be physical robots.
What is there out there that people would be surprised to learn about in the robotics area, let's say?
There are heavily automated warehouses where there are either very few or no people around. That absolutely took me by surprise.
It's on display at this huge distribution center in Devens, Massachusetts, where roughly 100 employees work alongside 69 robots that do all the heavy lifting and navigate a warehouse maze the size of 2 football fields, moving 10,000 pieces of merchandise a day from storage shelf to shipping point faster and more efficiently than human workers ever could.
We think it's part of the new American economy.
Bruce Welty is CEO of Quiet Logistics, which fills orders and ships merchandise for retailers in the apparel industry. This entire operation was designed around the small orange robots made by a company outside Boston called Kiva. and can now be found in warehouses all over the country.
Now, this is the order that she's filling, right, on this screen?
Yes. In a typical warehouse, she'd have to walk from location to location with a number of totes. And that's the innovation here, is that the product comes to her.
And all of this is pre-programmed? Nobody has to sit there and tell these robots where to go?
No, it's all done with algorithms. It's a lot of mathematics, a lot of science that went into this.
Customer orders are transmitted from a computer to Wi-Fi antennas that direct the robots to the merchandise, guiding them across an electronic checkerboard with barcodes embedded in the floor panels. Once the robot arrives at its destination, it picks up an entire shelf of merchandise and delivers it to the packing station. It then speeds off to its next assignment.
They know if they need to get from point A to point B and they're not carrying anything, they can go underneath the grid. We call that tunneling, so they're very smart.
You'd think they'd run into each other.
Yeah, you'd think that, but it never happens.
If you had to replace the robots with people, how many people would you have to hire?
Probably 1.5 people for every robot.
So it saves you a lot of money.
Yes.
And it's not just going on in warehouses. El Camino Hospital in California's Silicon Valley has a fleet of robots called tugs that ferry meals to patients, medicines to doctors and nurses, blood samples to the lab, and dirty linen to the laundry. A hospital spokesman told us the tugs are supposed to supplement nurses and hospital staff, not replace them. But he also believes that robots and humans working together is the beginning of a new era. Robots are now wielding scalpels for surgeons, assisting in the most delicate operations, allowing them to see and snip their way through prostate surgeries with minimal damage. And they've begun filling prescriptions in hospital dispensaries and local pharmacies. Economic evolution has been going on for centuries, and society has always successfully adapted to technological change, creating more jobs in the process. But Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee of MIT think this time may be different.
Technology is always creating jobs, it's always destroying jobs, but right now the pace is accelerating. It's faster, we think, than ever before in history. So as a consequence, we are not creating jobs at the same pace that we need to.
And we ain't seen nothing yet.
The changes are coming so quickly, it's been difficult for workers to retrain themselves and for entrepreneurs to figure out where the next opportunities may be. The catalyst is something called computer learning, or artificial intelligence, the ability to feed massive amounts of data into supercomputers and program them to teach themselves and improve their performance.
What's the weather like today?
It's how Apple was able to create Siri, the iPhone robot.
Here's the weather for today.
And Google, its self-driving car.
We've been amazed at how rapidly this has been happening.
This is Jeopardy!
IBM's Deep QA system that plays Jeopardy. We had a contest here. They played against our best MIT students, the best Harvard students we could put it up against, and not surprisingly, Watson won. And it's being used in real practical applications now on Wall Street and in call centers. Siri, millions of people are using that every day.
The fact that computers can now understand and respond to human speech, the fact that they can actually generate prose of decent quality, they can drive cars, they can win at Jeopardy. We're seeing technology demonstrate skills that it's never ever done before.
And it's putting new categories of jobs in the sights of automation, the 60% of the workforce that makes its living gathering and analyzing information. This piece of software, called e-discovery, is now used by law firms in the discovery portion of legal proceedings, a job that used to require hundreds of people sifting through boxes and boxes of documents. We now have robots gathering intelligence and fighting wars, and robot computers trading stocks on Wall Street. It's all part of a massive high-tech industry that's contributed enormous productivity and wealth to the American economy, but surprisingly little in the way of employment.
We absolutely are creating new jobs, new companies, and entirely new industries these days. When Eric and I go out to Silicon Valley and look around, the scale and the pace of creation is astonishing. What these companies are not doing, though, is hiring a ton of people to help them with their work.
Because they don't have them? Because they can't find them? Because they don't need them?
They can't find everyone they need, but they don't need that many people to work in these incredibly large and influential companies. To make that concrete, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google are now all public companies. Combined, they have something close to $1 trillion in market capitalization. Together, the four of them employ fewer than 150,000 people, and that's less than the number of new entrants into the American workforce every month.
And it's roughly half the number of people that work for General Electric. Ironically, one of the few bright spots is a modest rise in U.S. manufacturing, an early casualty of automation that is making a comeback because of it. This Tesla factory in California turns out battery-powered cars using state-of-the-art robots that can change tools and perform a multitude of different tasks, negating some of the advantages of moving jobs offshore. Annual investment by U.S. manufacturers in new technology has increased almost 30% since the recession ended, and research institutions and robotics companies funded by venture capital are constantly searching for innovations like the Roomba vacuum cleaner.
Traditional robots inside factories.
That was the brainchild of Rodney Brooks, a pioneer who ran the artificial intelligence lab at MIT before launching iRobot, one of the most successful robotics companies in the U.S. This is his latest progeny, a friendly, affordable chap named Baxter.
It's meant to be able to go in a factory where they don't have robots at the moment, and ordinary workers can train it to do simple tasks.
Such as?
Well, a simple one is for instance, picking stuff up off a conveyor belt. So it's going to go down and find the object and grab it and bring it over and put it to another spot.
Baxter costs $22,000 and can be trained to do a new task by a coworker in a matter of minutes. It can also be upgraded like an iPad with new software as new applications are developed.
And when you're training it,
Brooks and investors in his new startup, Rethink Robotics, see a potential market worth tens of billions of dollars and believe that Baxter could help small U.S. manufacturers level the playing field against low-cost foreign competitors.
if you're using robots to compete with the simple tasks that a low-paid worker does in a foreign country, you can bring it back here and do that task here.
Baxter costs $22,000.
Yep.
How long does he last?
Well, it's 3 years.
3 years.
So you can think of that as 6,500 hours.
I think it works out to about $3.40 an hour.
About that, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
$3.40, that's probably the wages of a Chinese worker,
Just
right?
about right there now.
So here, you could buy one of these robots. It would be like any Chinese worker.
In a manner of speaking.
That strategy has already had some success at Adept Technology, the largest manufacturer of industrial robots in the country with a wide and varied product line. John Dolcinas is the CEO.
So this is our flagship product. This is our Cobra robot. This is the class of robot that was used to automate Philips electric shavers.
The robots at the Dutch company's factory in the Netherlands proved to be so efficient and economical that Philips decided to move its main shaver assembly line out of China and back to Holland.
I think that those workers in China, in India, are more in the bullseye of this automation tidal wave that we're talking about than the American workers.
But even if offshore manufacturing returns to the U.S., most of the jobs will go to robots.
When I see what computers and robots can do right now, I project that forward for 2-3 more generations. I think we're going to find ourselves in a world where the work, as we currently think about it, is largely done by machines.
And what are the people going to do?
That's the $64,000 question. Science fiction is actually my best guide because I think we are, in that time frame, going to be in a very weird, very different place.
It brings to mind Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey and the rebellious computer robot HAL. Technologically speaking, we are just about there.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
Everyone agrees that it's impossible now to short-circuit technology. It has a life of its own, and the world is all in for better or for worse.
Stop, Dave.
We wanted to leave you on this positive note.
One thing that Andy and I agree on is that we're not super worried about robots becoming self-aware and challenging our authority. That part of science fiction, I think, is not very likely to happen.
I think if I were to try to summarize all of this in a few sentences, it would be, we have reached the point where the ability to produce a machine costs less than to reproduce a human being socially. And when that threshold is reached, there is a declining need for humans. Now, Henry Kissinger, who was very visible in US geopolitics, made a statement several years ago. He said, the problem in the world is not limited resources, it is too many people. So what do you do if people get in the way? I think that we could face a brutal future, the likes of which we have not seen hitherto. But we hope things will not come to that particular point, right? But it is worth noting here that nature, I want to read a passage to you quickly, and then you might try to guess who wrote this, right? Nature builds no machines, no locomotives, no railways, electric telegraphs, self-acting mules. These are products of human industry, natural material transformed into organs of human will over nature, or of the human participation in nature. They are organs of the human brain created by the human hand, the power of knowledge objectified. The development of fixed capital indicates to what degree general social knowledge has become a direct force of production, and to what degree, hence, the conditions of the process of social life itself have come under the control of the general intellect and been transformed in accordance with it. What do you think wrote that? I didn't, okay? But this is important. This was written in the 19th century. Here we are in the 21st century. So prophetic and so relevant. Right? Now, this scientific and technological revolution driven by robotics, artificial intelligence, the algorithm, this process of transforming massive amounts of information from the human hands and minds to transform phenomena and change the world. This is it. The thinking machine, if you will. And since we are at an early point here, the question becomes, what does it imply for a region like the Caribbean? Now, the crisis in Barbados seems to be peculiar for a number of reasons, because along the way, a lot of people were saying, that can't happen here. We know better than that, right? But it is also interesting to understand, I think, that as we go through the process, we have to ask some questions. When I was in graduate school back in the day, in the early 1970s, I used to read economic development literature, and there was an expression that was very popular: growth without development. And at first I said, this sounds like cockamamie mumbo jumbo. How can you have growth without development? Can't you see the development around you? And I think what was being argued there is that the economic growth we saw here in this video is to facilitate the deepening of the accumulation of capital and not to meet social needs. That is the deepening contradiction that we face at this particular moment. So I asked myself, what are some of the things happening in the Caribbean today that we need to think about? And I thought I would look very briefly, just in passing for your information, at things happening in the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, in Guyana, and in Jamaica. Jamaica and Guyana were very high in the 50s, 60s, bauxite. Alcoa, Alcan, Jamaica, Alpart, and a number of other companies. And today, the largest conglomerate doing bauxite and related mining is a Russian company called Rusal, R-U-S-A-L. And they are involved from the beginning to the end of the process. And they're now the biggest company doing business in Jamaica. Not an American company or a Canadian company. But all the Americans are invested in Rusal. So it doesn't depend on the nationality of the capital. It's the global configuration of it. That is where the focus needs to be at this particular time. And that is creating tremendous problems for what we understand by sovereign autonomy. So in Jamaica, there is now a great interest in other forms of mining beyond bauxite, searching for silver and other important materials. And it has been argued from literature I looked at that Haiti is said to have under those mountains a matter of 24 to 30 billion dollars worth of materials to be extracted. But think of what that is going to mean when they get into it. You cut off the top of the mountains, you dig through the mountains, you bring out from the bowels of the earth all those chemicals that pollute from the human body to the world. The water, the streams, potable water, land for growing food. In America, hydrofracking today is so dangerous that it is destroying livelihoods. And President Obama tells you that this is bringing us to something called energy independence. Oh yeah? Think about it. Take it very seriously. They're not interested in any energy independence, because if you were, you don't want to dominate the whole world. There would be no need to do it, right? But in these countries I mentioned, we find that very few jobs are being created with this massive growth. In 1990, on a global scale, 25 million jobs existed in the complex of global mining. In 2013, it is 5 million jobs. So who are the people getting the jobs? And who are the people whose lands are being alienated in a massive way, left without the land to grow food, to feed themselves, their families, reproduce themselves, while the water and the environment are being destroyed? And if you take a pragmatic neoclassical economic argument, it would be this is the price of progress. But the price of progress means a massive forms of human degradation. Right? There's no doubt that there's progress. Is progress for whom? There's no general progress in that particular sense. So these four countries are going through this trauma. And in the interest of time, then, there is Cuba. Harrowing experiences, still under the heavy weight of the illegal embargo, or whatever you want to call it, the U.S. imposed on Cuba since the early period of the Cuban Revolution. And the entire world, today there are only two countries in the United Nations that vote that object to the blockade: the United States and Israel. 182 countries last September voted in the UN to lift the blockade. And the US, using this vulgar doctrine called American exceptionalism, say we don't have to listen to the EU, our closest allies, the Canadians, the French, the Chinese, the Russians, nobody. We are not going to lift it. I happen to think that there's going to be some important changes there. But it's worth noting that Cuba now is at the point where it has gone through this transition to tourism, and they have also radically restructured the sugar industry in Cuba to the point now where, when Cuba produced 10 million tons of canes and massive tonnage of sugar in a much smaller number of far more sophisticated factories. It means that a large number of workers from the countryside in Cuba now are hurting because of this radical and revolutionary transition. The Brazilians have just built, in alliance with the Cubans, a massive transshipment port on Mariel, the point where a lot of people were leaving under Jimmy Carter and coming to Florida. That is now a massive transshipment port at the cost of $950 million US. The French are entering into alliance with the Cubans on hepatitis research. The Cubans are doing some of the most sophisticated work in the world on hepatitis. The EU as a whole, the Chinese, the Russians, people are flocking to Cuba to do business, but we are not finding people flocking to this part of the Caribbean to do anything. And we ask some questions why. Now, of course, the Cuban labor force is highly educated. The World Bank recently issued a report on Cuba which says Cuba has the highest standards of education in all of Latin America. So how does a country suffering so much under the whip of the US imperial project still survive like that? Right? And then the Cubans are very visible in West Africa, in Ebola perhaps, not on the same scale of the US, because the US has a military piece in there which is to control West Africa through AFRICOM, right? So you notice that they send a lot of soldiers and a limited number of medical and technical staff. So there's a geopolitical project going on there. That suggests to me that there's a lot about the Cuban experience that we can learn a lot from. I am convinced, of course, right, I'll close soon, that the Cubans have drawn away a good portion of the tourist traffic that was flowing through the wider Caribbean. But they've been forced to do that, and at the beginning they kept wondering if it was possible to have a regional strategy on tourism development. But investors don't do that. They want to go where they prefer to go for whatever their reasons, and you may have a political view of a region, how you restructure and integrate it. And that is not their aim. I think in the region we are still lingering on the certain impacts. One of them is that if you go to 1950, the British introduced the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement Act. Britain came out of the war. It wanted a massive amount of cheap raw materials from the colonies so they would not have to invest in any of those things at home. The Commonwealth Sugar Agreement Act gave a lease on life to places like Barbados to continue producing sugar on an uneconomical basis because it was part of how you manage decolonization. You had the European integration, the British in 1967 entering the European Common Market. Can they drag all of these people from the other neo-colonies in them with their commodities? The Europeans said, no, you can't do that. You have to start cutting your ties with them. Then we had another moment with Lomé and the EPA, and each one of these has worked to maintain certain features of relative economic backwardness in our region to keep us supposedly humming. About 2 decades ago, the Canadians made an announcement. They said the Canada we see moving into the 21st century will have little or no need for anything produced in the Caribbean, apart from, say, some bauxite or a few other products. Says the manufacturing and the secondary, says that's not important for Canada. The US has said technically the same thing. So where does it leave us? I think in a quandary, in a bind, in an extremely difficult situation, right? And I don't know that what the way is going to be out of this. But I can tell you one thing. I would argue, as I do in some of my work, and I'm going to quote here briefly from James Petrus, and then I will conclude. Petrus wrote this year, quote, "The massive growth of the secret political police, the National Security Agency, the shredding of constitutional guarantees, the conversion of electoral processes into elite control multi-billion-dollar charades, the growing impunity of police involved in civilian murders speak to an emerging totalitarian police state inside the United States as a counterpart to the violent pursuit of world power." He says that a majority of Americans oppose this strategy by the US for global supremacy, and concludes his point by saying, we must turn from intervening against democracy abroad to building a democratic welfare republic at home. My point here is that it makes no sense to provide an analysis of these sort of structural political economy dynamics without asking big questions about the political implications at that point where people live, where they reproduce themselves, and where they hope for a brighter future. So it is to ask, is there a bright future for democracy as we have understood it, unless it comes from below? Because I have argued that, and following the Italian philosopher Domenico Losurdo in a book called Liberalism, A Counter-History, a very fascinating work, came out a few years ago. And in it he reaches the conclusion that from the French Revolution, at least right through to this moment, all struggles for popular democracy have originated among the people, the ordinary people, and not people who rule. Their aim has not been democracy. Let me conclude by going back to 1948. 1948, George Kennan, who became the US architect on the Cold War and was US ambassador to the Soviet Union, wrote in an article that was published in Foreign Affairs. He says, the time is coming when we, the United States, cannot afford the luxury of talking about democracy, human rights, individual rights, justice, and all these freedoms. He says that's a very convenient thing to talk about, but our aim is security, and the moment you get into all these platitudes about freedom and justice, you open the space for the radicals and the leftists to get involved in the politics, and he says that is bad. So the post-war security strategy of the US was never grounded in the pursuit or the edification of democracy. Not so, concretely. But it has been paraded that way. And when I make that big claim, I allow room for the spaces of contention and resistance that have evolved, right? Where people, in spite of all of that, continue to fight. And that is where I think the hope lies. But I don't think it is going to come to us from above. And this particular crisis of global capitalism is one that is bringing wrenching change. And as we deal with this change, we have to deal with those other dynamics, which I call the ones that affect the human body. the stress, the uncertainty, the frustration that intensifies ailments like high blood pressure and diabetes and a whole lot of other things that are complicated by the bad diets that a lot of working class people are forced to consume because they can't afford to reproduce themselves at a higher level. Poverty is an expression of the lack of an ability to control the circumstances of your existence. And if it is true, the video shows that there's a growing situation in which the need for humans in the production of goods and services is deteriorating, then, who are going to buy the commodities? No one says that it is not a fantastic thing and perhaps a wonderful thing to come to the point where these robots can do all the drudgery. I think that is important. But that's not being done to improve the quality of life for large numbers of people, but to enrich the top. In the US today, it is estimated at least $1.3 to $1.5 trillion owned by the big corporate interests are in banks or in US Treasury bonds. It's cheaper to put it there than to invest in the things that would transform the conditions of the world. And lastly, and I sent this piece to Don some time back, my friend Don Marshall here this evening, that it is estimated by a unit called the Tax Justice Network that between $23 and $52 trillion owned by the top 2% in the world are housed in, the 23 of the 53 trillion are housed in tax havens around the world. They can't find what they call productive outlets for their money. It becomes 53 trillion if you add the mansions and the yachts and the private planes and the jewelry and so on that the wealthy people have. Their aim is not the qualitative improvement of people. They will say it. And as long as you take the market out of the political economy and objectify it, you can talk about the free markets until you die. But I think we're at a moment of what I call legal globalization, where a form of what one scholar calls imperial law becomes the foundation now for determining what the market preferences should be. And then when humans get involved, and this is a humans clog up the system, can we free our dependence on humans and move to a brave new world which is not designed to bring about the changes that we need? And with that, it is 9 o'clock, and I said I was going to speak within this time, and I'm going to stop here and thank you and hope that we have an interesting discussion coming out of this. Thank you very much.